Okay, cool. All right, thanks for joining me, Aviva. So, okay, we're obviously meeting virtually, but if we were having this conversation at a coffee shop, so I'm ordering an oat milk latte. What are you getting?
I'm super boring. I really like coffee, but I try to avoid it. So I usually go for like a black tea, like an English breakfast tea or an Earl Grey. I really love my tea.
Hmm, me too. I love that. Yeah, it's one of those days where I really need the caffeine, but if I've already had a few, I'm also going to be getting like maybe an oolong or of like a nice loose leaf white tea.
Mm.
Um, So, what's kind of your role in the pro-truth campaign? What do you do? Have you been there since the beginning? Just tell me more about it.
Yeah, so we launched Pro Truth in 2018, but we had been working on it for about a year before we officially launched it. And I actually came up with the idea of the campaign. And so at this point, I direct the campaign and I'm a staff person at the National Council of Jewish Women New York, which is the lead organization on the Pro Truth campaign. And it really was sort of born out of what we were seeing in in New York and in particularly, progressive um spaces in New York where people didn't necessarily know that what a crisis pregnancy center was, that it existed. And if they maybe knew a little bit about it, they didn't realize that like they existed here in New York. They thought that's something for Texas or Ohio, and they didn't know that there are crisis pregnancy centers everywhere, including in New York City, the supposed, abortion capital of the world. And so we really felt like we wanted to do something that educated people around the issue of crisis pregnancy centers for people who consider themselves advocates in progressive spaces, but also, and more importantly, for people who are targeted by crisis pregnancy centers. And, um, we've always said like our mission is not to shut these places down. They have a right to exist, but we believe that they should be honest about their agenda and what they're trying to do. And we want everyone to be able to access reproductive health care in a choice in a facility of their choice. And so if they want to receive care at a crisis pregnancy center, that's their prerogative. But if they don't, then they should know that these places exist and how to avoid them, because what they do so well is to try to look and sound like a legitimate clinic in, you know, purposefully to try to get people, unsuspecting people, to come in and essentially trick them into using their services. So if people know that these places exist before they're in a situation where they might need them, they could be on the lookout. They could talk to their friends, to their community members about them, and they could choose where they get their healthcare from.
Yeah, no, it's funny you said like you think of that as a play like a thing that you would find. You think of these centers as a thing you'd find in other states. We definitely have a big issue with that here in Pennsylvania. PA was actually the first state to divert public funding to crisis pregnancy centers. And so they outnumber abortion clinics in our state by, I mean, a large amount. They've received over $100 million in public money since the 90s here in Pennsylvania. And pretty much for every dollar that goes towards like women's healthcare at like abortion clinics, a dollar has to go to crisis pregnancy centers, which is just kind of bonkers. Is there any landscape like that for public funding in New York?
So we're really lucky. We are a state that does not fund crisis pregnancy centers at this point. We have seen examples of individual lawmakers who use discretionary funds to fund individual crisis pregnancy centers in their district. Um, and again, that's something we can't stop an individual lawmaker from doing. It's their discretionary funds and they're allowed to use it as they see fit. But when we have seen instances of that happen, we've done what we can to bring attention to those individual lawmakers and essentially like remind their constituents that your representative is using your tax dollars on a facility that lies and deceives people. And, you should let them know that that's not how you would like that money to be spent. But yeah, the public funding of crisis pregnancy centers is a huge issue. And, we've seen it on the city, state, and federal level that it helps legitimize these places, and it also it helps them to have more facilities across the country, and that is part of their strategy, right? The more places that they set up, the more chances that somebody will accidentally come in to a crisis pregnancy center. So it really is a numbers game for them, and they've been able to get state legislatures to fund them, and they've also worked to get a lot of money through federal family planning grants that they use to to support them as well.
Yeah, no, that's kind of wild. I mean, I like how you pointed out that sort of the main issue that much of the work that these centers are doing is just like perfectly fine. Like here in Pittsburgh, there's a lot of centers that they give out diapers and kids' clothes. I mean, and that's all like super awesome. And it's just honing in on like that deceptive practices that it's like, really anyone can buy like an ultrasound machine off of Amazon, apparently, right? And
Yeah.
you need to make sure you're actually going to a real medical clinic. Like just the deception itself is the main issue. And I like being focused on it because I don't know, it just feels like just being clear about our information is kind of what we have to offer to this, right? Like that they're intentionally being deceptive, intentionally being like, oh yeah, we have staff that are trained to give ultrasounds. It's like, well, are they a nurse, right? Or are they a trained staff? Or like, no. Um, so when did like you first become aware of these clinics, Aviva? Like, have you known about them your whole life? Or like, how did you learn about them initially?
Yeah, I'll totally answer that question, but I also wanted to go back to something you said in terms of like handing out diapers or material aid, which is something a lot of these places do, but a lot of them also tie that material aid to like religious classes that they offer or like church groups that they're affiliated with,
Ooh,
which,
yeah.
you know, is also, in our opinion, not appropriate. And like, and I think from our perspective, what we feel is that if there is a need for those services, then that should be done through organizations that are, not tying those services or those material needs to any sort of behavior or specific thought process. And like,
Yeah.
from our perspective, like our organization does a lot of different direct service programs, including a food pantry, right? And like, we would never require a food pantry participant to like go to a class on, Judaism, for instance.
Yeah.
And so like, that is, there's like a bit of an ick factor there as well in terms of like, are you making those services dependent on, again, furthering your beliefs and agenda?
Yeah, like it's not really free. You're not really
Mhm.
giving something freely if, whether it's you're charging money for it or whether you're charging attendance at some kind of class or Bible study, like that's not actually a free service.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
No, that's an important distinction. Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's here in like here in this area, I think we're in Allegheny County, and so we have a lot of funding for different social service programs. But I think when we look at like rural Pennsylvania, there's a lot of places that literally don't have any spots to go to for free diapers, like that don't have, any services at all. And so it's like that's almost an issue about like spreading resources equally, right? Like across the state. Some people don't even have access to it. Maybe like the only place within an hour's drive, if they even have a
Yeah.
car,
Mhm.
giving out diapers would be a crisis pregnancy center. And so it's just sort of, it's almost like entrapment. It's sort of hard to access things depending on where you are, depending on your poverty levels. I don't know. There's just a lot of considerations.
Absolutely. And we actually we worked last legislative session with our state legislature to do kind of a study of these in the bill. They're called limited service pregnancy centers, but really to understand the impact they're having across the state on pregnant people and pregnancy outcomes, and understanding like where there are gaps of services across the state, because here in New York City there's a lot of services and access to services, but across New York State there's a lot of more rural areas, and there are real service deserts. And so trying to understand the landscape of services for pregnant people and people who have just had children, to understand where they can get services and how limited service pregnancy centers or crisis pregnancy centers are impacting those services. Unfortunately, the study has not been able to begin because a crisis pregnancy center sued to stop the study from happening.
Oh,
So,
well, why would that? Why don't you want people to just know the truth?
right. What could you be hiding if you don't want to have a state study? Yeah, so right now that is being worked out. But it's sort of again, yeah, what are you hiding? What can't we know about what's operating, how you're operating, and why is a study so threatening to you? All of those are really good questions.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of conversation, since Roe v. Wade fell, about some of these centers collecting data and how they might be using data in a sort of surveillance way in places like Texas, or places where anti-choice people would be, or anti-abortion folks want to pass bans. Have you looked into, obviously it can be kind of hard to figure out what these centers are up to if they especially don't want to, share the truth, but have you looked into or thought about, in the pro-truth campaign, ways that these centers are collecting data on women and how they could use that in sort of a threatening way in other states especially?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen examples even before all of these laws have been passed that crisis pregnancy centers have been abusing people's data, because, you know, the power of these places is that they look and sound like legitimate clinics. And so when people come in, they think they're at a medical center and they fill out information about themselves. If they're not an actual licensed medical center, they're not bound by HIPAA, the privacy laws that protect us as patients. And so we have heard of instances of crisis pregnancy centers, particularly using a person's emergency contact to get in touch with somebody's partner or parent, to say, did you know this person came in here looking to get an abortion? Which can be incredibly dangerous to somebody given, their home situation, if there's a reason they're not telling their, people in their family about wanting to seek an abortion. So it's,
Whoa.
yeah, so that has already been happening, and is such a glaring example of how these places deceive people, how they abuse, their power, but also how little they actually care about a pregnant person and the safety and well-being of that person. Because if they're willing to put them at risk of, a situation at home that might be unsafe for them.
I mean, yeah, that's really dangerous actually. Women who are in a relationship that might lean towards domestic violence, right? That those experiences often come out when the woman in the relationship is in a more vulnerable position, such as like
Mhm.
pregnancy. That's when those tendencies will start coming out. And I mean, that's pretty scary. Especially like maybe a teenager or a college student whose parents would maybe cut them off from funding, if they
Right. They could
knew.
kick them out of their house. They could, and because these places try to look and sound like legitimate clinics, a person goes in and they think they have those protections around their privacy and how their information is going to be used. And that is not always the case.
Yeah, that's ugh. That's kind of creepy.
Yeah, it's
I've heard,
awful.
yeah, we've heard stories here in Pittsburgh. There's been studies that have tied, STI outbreaks to these clinics because they're not certified, they're not real clinics, they're not sterilizing their ultrasound like vaginal wands. I mean,
Oh
and that's
God.
that's the worst we've heard. I mean, I think that one's even more sinister because it's more like of a physical safety situation. Like they could actually ruin someone's life using that call. Ugh.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe circling back, I don't know if we answered this. When did you first hear about these clinics and when did you first become aware of them? And what was that kind of like for you?
Yeah, so I think um in New York City, there used to be on the subways these ads, and they would be sort of like a forlorn looking person. They're sad, they're emotional, and it would say pregnant with a question mark, and then like just a number to call. And um, and then when I started getting more involved with local reproductive rights advocacy, which was probably about 2015, 2016, I was sitting with somebody who had been doing this work in New York for a long time. And they're like, have you ever seen those ads on the subway? I was like, yeah. They're like, that's for a crisis pregnancy center. So the truth was that like I had been exposed to them before I even knew that they existed, which is the case for a lot of people. But I really became aware once I started doing a lot more in-depth advocacy work on a local level and talking to other advocates who have been doing this for even longer than I have, on some of the core issues here in New York around accessing abortion. And by the way,
Yeah.
those subway ads are now no longer legal thanks to a New York City bill that was passed that requires in advertising around crisis pregnancy centers, they have to have like a disclosure that they're not a licensed medical provider. So they've
Yeah.
stopped doing a lot of those kinds of ads.
Interesting. So yeah, again, just not willing to like put that accurate description. But if you can't if you have to if you can't hide the truth, like then they're not even running the ads. That's sort of bonkers to me.
Yeah. And I think, for us, like that's really what the core of this campaign is about. Like we want them to just be honest about what their goal is. And we want there to be regulation and oversight of these places so that they can't just lie to people. They can't just get away with these absurd tactics that they have used. And there should be some requirement for there to be transparency and honesty about what they're actually trying to do because they've been able to hide behind a lot of this deception, and that has given them a lot of power.
Yeah. I'm thinking now of the current landscape where a lot of people who can become pregnant are, traveling to other states to receive care. And I'm curious how the pro-truth campaign, like, have you seen people coming in from out of state and having to help people navigate like a new climate in New York City? Because I mean, I saw a really tragic news piece on CNN from a woman, I believe, who's from Tennessee, who had to come to New York City for an abortion. And she was really sad that she couldn't recover, in her own room. She was in sort of like a tiny apartment bedroom from just a kind stranger. Um, and I'm just curious if you think that these crisis pregnancy centers have found an opportunity to deceive people coming in from states where abortion's not legal. Like have they changed their tactics at all to try to reach out of state visitors?
Yes. So we have seen them talk about openly wanting to kind of bombard abortion friendly states because they know that people are going to be coming here to access services, and they're trying to create as many barriers to people actually accessing services. So, if you're coming from another state, you might not know anybody around here. You might, be in a situation where you're traveling alone and there's a lot going on. It's emotional, it's scary,
Yeah.
it's a highly sensitive time. And so they're looking to take advantage of that and have as many crisis pregnancy centers possible to try to trick people. If it's not your local clinic, it's not the place you're used to going, if there's a crisis pregnancy center next door, across the street, that could add to confusion. We have in one of the biggest Planned Parenthood clinics in the state. Here in Brooklyn, there's a crisis pregnancy center in the same building. It's literally like 2 floors away. And
Wow.
so you get in the elevator and it's just a matter of like pressing the right button. And again, if like this isn't the place you're used to going and you're dealing with all of these other factors, it's not unthinkable that like you would be confused and you wouldn't know which place to go to. And they name themselves to sound like legitimate clinics. And there was a clinic in the Bronx that was across the street from another Planned Parenthood that literally had a sign, this huge sign outside it saying planning your parenthood.
Oh,
And like this was in a very heavily like Spanish speaking area. So like if English is not, the language you're most comfortable with, Planned Parenthood and planning your parenthood, that's a very nuanced thing to have to distinguish between. So these are all things that are intentional and part of a larger plan that they have. And as abortion gets more restricted across this country and as people have fewer places to go, they'll basically just be able to narrow in on those locations and really try to overwhelm with the number of crisis pregnancy centers.
wow. No, that's something I didn't even think about that, if the kinds of people who are supporting crisis pregnancy centers feel that they've won, in a state like Texas, that they can then almost increase their funding in neighboring states to lead some of these deceptive advertising campaigns. I mean, it's funny because when you mentioned like naming their clinics similarly, my first thought was, oh, well, Planned Parenthood's a pretty well-known name. And I was thinking about the smaller independent abortion clinics that they might be more easily spoofed because it's not like a nationwide known name. But then you immediately gave the example. It's like, no, Planned Parenthood's not immune to having their name spoofed. I mean, it's just gross, right? Like it's just making me feel kind of gross about hitting people when they're vulnerable. I was just traveling for my kids' spring break, and when you're in a new place, you're nervous, you don't feel like quite at home. And it's especially New York City being such a travel hub, like that could be the first place that folks are able to afford a cheap flight to get care. It's sort of sad that even there, even like they aren't completely safe from this deception.
Yeah, and I think in terms of sort of our strategy in dealing with that is um to partner with abortion funds who are helping people facilitate this travel to make sure that they're talking to their clients about crisis pregnancy centers and what to be aware of and the signs of what to look out for so that they're putting it on their radar and helping them hopefully navigate those situations so that they don't end up in a crisis pregnancy center.
That's good. Yeah, I was going to ask about some other partnerships that the Pro-Truth campaign has had. So you're partnering with abortion funds. Do you have a strong relationship with many of the clinics in the city?
Not so much with the clinics. I mean, we are partnered with Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, but we also, don't necessarily want to partner with individual clinics because we don't want to come off that we're like promoting any clinic in particular. But what we
Mhm.
have partnered with is a lot of community-based organizations who work with people who are targeted by crisis pregnancy centers. So we have a really great partnership with the Latina Institute of New York, and they work with a lot of young women in the Bronx and again, a lot of Spanish speaking women. And they talk to their communities, and we think that's so powerful to have those partnerships with organizations that are already working with those communities, that have those
Mhm.
relationships, that have that trust,
Mhm.
um, to be able to navigate how to have those conversations. And we're sort of there to provide resources, support, help however we can. Um, but recognize that it's not necessarily our place to be going into those communities and talking about where people should be getting their health care, and
Mhm.
rather creating strong partnerships with groups that already have those relationships and those connections.
That's awesome. Yeah, it does sort of feel like a lot of these campaigns to promote to divert people away from legitimate reproductive health clinics. I think a lot of them do kind of target different races. Like they sort of have like a racial element to them of like it feels a little white supremacist-y, the way that they kind of target and different racial communities, like
Mm-hmm.
who are maybe minorities in this country who maybe aren't as good of English speakers. Um, yeah, that's really important to kind of reach the communities where they are.
They
Yeah.
also will also target like college students.
Okay.
That's a big group because, you know, a lot of college students are really in need of free medical services. And so like if there's, a free pregnancy test and ultrasound, like that's attractive to a college student. So they will also often set up in neighborhoods around colleges.
Oh,
And sometimes
it,
even they get to like they will partner with college groups and be able to like advertise on campus. And that is also something that we've tried to work with universities and colleges to make them aware of the dangers of these places and why they shouldn't be allowed to advertise on on campus.
Tell me more about that because we spoke with some college students here in Pittsburgh who are sort of working to get their university more aware because here we have in the Pitt News, University of Pittsburgh's paper, the crisis pregnancy centers advertise. So that's something that it's been a lot, it's been a fight, for these students to try to figure out how to get ads removed in on-campus bulletin boards, on-campus newspapers. What has it been like for you in New York City? Like, how has it differed? And have you had successes there in fighting misinformation on campus?
So we haven't done it so much in New York City. We because we also have a Pro Truth Florida campaign that we partner with NCJW Miami on.
Oh, okay.
Um and so the Florida group has been working more on that and it's been a grind really. And I think it's really about getting some ground support within the university and bringing it to the upper levels of decision makers. There are going to be administrations that are more open and willing to listen, and some that are less.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to get support from clubs and even professors, but also again to raise awareness. So like if there's a student publication that would be willing to write about the truth of crisis pregnancy centers and point out that like the university is allowing them to have paid advertisements in a
Sure.
publication, like that could be really powerful. Doing some sort of like petitioning around you know getting them stop giving them advertising space just to show the support that students how many students would support an initiative like that.
Yeah, I like that idea of it being student led. Um, so you said, okay, so the Pro Truth campaign's active in New York, active in Miami/Florida. Are
Mm-hmm.
there any other locations that you're active in or like moving into?
Not right now. um we're open, we're interested if there are areas or sections that would want to get involved. We certainly are open to that, but for
Yeah.
right now this is where we are.
That's pretty exciting that it's sort of like open to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Listen, I
so
mean, the thing about crisis pregnancy centers is that it's an issue everywhere. So like, yeah, we're willing to it's a campaign that could be replicated in other places. The campaign in New York and Miami looks slightly different because like Florida and New York are two very different landscapes when it comes to abortion access and reproductive rights. So it's certainly adaptable because the core message around like the education and activism around crisis pregnancy center remains the same. you know, just how exactly that might look might be dependent on where you live.
Yeah. No, I love that. So yeah, I guess before we kind of wrap, do you have any big wins or any things that you're particularly proud of to share, or like a success story of one person you reached, right? Like any highlights?
So passing the study bill was a huge exciting thing because we really felt like it would create a not only like help us to understand the landscape of how these places are impacting pregnant people, but also give us some data about what's actually happening in these places. Because as you mentioned, like it's really hard to know what's happening in these places. And getting a non, you know, partisan group like the Department of Health to just have some underlying data would be really helpful in understanding the full picture. We also got a New York City bill passed, which is going to allow for a large scale campaign, an education campaign in New York City,
Wow.
which we were really excited about because they will have a much wider reach than we can do. So spreading the word and getting the message out is so important. So those have been two really big wins for us.
Yay. That's so awesome. I'm feeling really inspired. I'm kind of getting ideas for things that maybe we can do in Pittsburgh, right? Like I think it's a real model. And I hope that we can see pro-truth campaigns like all over the country in the future. Um, but yeah, so I guess for a listener today who's super fired up and wants to get involved, what should they do?
Well, you could start by going to protruthy.org, which is our pro-truth website. And that is where sort of like our hub of information is. Like, I didn't even talk about like we have this amazing interactive map that plots out every crisis pregnancy center across the state, along with
Wow.
actual legitimate clinics. So if people are looking for services, they can you know, find a service you know, a clinic near them, but also like just gives a really important visual of like these places across New York and how many of them there are. But there's also a ton of information about crisis pregnancy centers and ways to get involved. And you know, I think the first most important step is to start like talking about these places with your friends, with your communities, because again, so many people don't know that these places exist and the potential harm that they pose to people. And we want people to have that awareness and to be talking about it and to sort of you know, end the secrecy around these places so that they don't get to trick and deceive people, because we know that they're there and we're on the lookout.
Yeah, I like that, just talking about it. I think a lot of people don't know, and these kinds of places can really thrive in the shadows. So just sort of like let's just get that spotlight going so that there's not any shadows, nowhere to hide. Because
Absolutely.
the truth is not something to be scared of. And I just love that pro-truth, the way you've named the campaign, because it's really just about facts. It's not, it's just facts. Like there's nothing to be
Exactly.
scared of about the truth.
As there shouldn't be for some, you know.
That's awesome. Well, I'm like really glad that we got to talk about this. I'm so inspired by the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me
Yeah, it was
just,
great to connect.
yeah,